to do it down here?
Sure. Mind if we don't get it?
Yeah, that's fine.
Wherever you're comfortable. So I was going to introduce Leah Pullin. Leah and I have worked together for many, many years, too many to remember, in a couple of different consulting firms. She's a great person and a great consultant. And I have so much respect for her and her husband, Lee. They go to all the garden places in the world, like Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Sudan, things like that. And they're amazing faith and fearless disciples of Jesus Christ. I'll tell you a story. About 10 years ago, I was chasing a project in Saudi Arabia with a company out there, and I was trying to staff it with our consultants, and Leah kept begging me to go to Saudi. And sending a woman to Saudi Arabia was not something I was interested in doing, but she wanted to go so she could talk to the Muslims over there. That's just who she is. She and Leah both that way. Just quick story. When she was 34, she was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. She had 2 kids at the time, 3 and 9 months. And the statistics say she wouldn't be alive for 5 years. Thank God she's here with us now. She's been cancer-free. Cancer-free for 15 years, and their son Hudson is now a freshman in college, and their daughter Grace is 16 years old. It's been a long time, and I'm going to let her tell you the rest of the story, but I want to share one particular part of it that just amazes me. I still, when I get goosebumps when I hear about this part, I think about it. After her cancer, and she was cancer-free, Pakistan was looking for a woman in the U.S. to help them develop a breast cancer awareness program. And Leah was on that list, and she was on the short list. And I'll never forget, Leah, when you told me one time, they'll probably never call me. I haven't heard from them about 3 weeks because I told them if they picked me, I'd have to share how my faith in Jesus Christ got me through this. And I probably just won't hear from her again. And the next thing I know, she told me that the guy emailed back and said, I'm from the government, I can't comment on your email, but we picked you. For me, that tells you how God is working in this world. I mean, it was not by accident that she came through this, not by accident she was picked by Pakistan, and she's been there, and I'm sure she'll share some of that story with you. Leah, Lee, and their daughter Grace live in Katy. They attend Kingsland Baptist Church. Their son, Hudson, is at Texas A&M, and he moves in here. Right. And he's in College Station, and it's my great pleasure to give you Leah Pullin.
So I'll start down here because you might be able to hear me a little bit better. So Paul just told the story, so I can sit down. I have nothing else to say. Not really. Okay, so I'll start from the beginning. Like Paul said, Lee and I do have 2 kids. First of all, yes, my husband's name is Lee, and mine is Leah. He always tells everyone that when he gets older, he did that on purpose so he can remember my name. So he can sit there and go, what is... So we do have 2 kids. Like Paul said, Hudson is up at A&M. Actually, he's home for the summer, which is another adjustment. You know, you send them off, and then they come home. Grace is 16, driving, so that's another experience. But Hudson in high school was an athlete, so I was immersed in the world of baseball, and there's not any crying in baseball. Now, my daughter is a dancer, and this was her first year on drill team at school, and there is a lot of crying on drill team. There's also a lot of, Mom, you don't understand a 16-year-old girl. And I'm thinking, you are so right, I don't understand a 16-year-old girl, but we were at competition. I walk into the dressing room, and all the girls, I mean, they're all crying. I'm like, girls, what is, I mean, I thought they did great, right? So I'm like, girls, what is wrong? The judge looked at us mean. She was blowing her nose. She was not, it was just, oh. Anyway, 16-year-old girl. So those are my kids. I part-time, but Paul mentioned that we've worked together for many, many years. I work part-time, which is an oxymoron. It actually means full-time for part-time pay. But I do work part-time and still doing environmental consulting. I graduated from A&M in 91, so I grew up with the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which is a little disturbing when I think back to all the changes we've seen in the chemical industry and the refining industry. But that's my background, mainly air. I do a lot of air permitting, due diligence, audits, all kind of the gamut of air quality. So, like Paul mentioned, I was diagnosed with cancer in 2003, but I have to complete the whole story, I have to go back just a little bit. Leah and I were married in 1993, and around 1996, we started through a long series of events, but we started traveling around the world. We started in Ukraine and Russia, and what we found immediately was all those years that the Iron Curtain had been up and they had been separated from the Western world, that God was working in those countries despite the lack of the Western church there. And we kind of got a little bit intrigued by that, God invites us to join him in his work, but he can work without us. So we started, thank you. So now I'm really loud. So we started, after the Ukraine, we began going into China and Mongolia. Around 1997, we made our first trip into Bangladesh, which per capita, next to Indonesia, is the largest Muslim country in the world. It doesn't have a lot of actual land area, but people are packed in there. So I was still working this whole time. My husband owns a business, so we would go about twice a year, 2-3 times a year, maybe back and forth over there. We worked really closely with the missionaries, but what we found was that Muslim, especially men, were coming to Christ in record numbers. They still are, now it's spread all through North Africa. But especially back then, in the beginning years, in the early years, you were seeing men just really decide Islam isn't the truth, and they would choose to follow Christ. What we found, though, the largest issue we were trying to overcome is reaching the women. So I could go into a village, and I could start talking to a Muslim woman, but immediately, as soon as I started asking her about her beliefs, she would have to go and get her husband. And then I would have to talk to her husband. Well, because of the culture, I wasn't allowed to talk to her husband. So we were immediately stopped. I couldn't get in a conversation with a woman to have a heart-to-heart conversation with her without the husband intervening and changing the subject or stopping us altogether. So, like I said, all these men were coming to Christ, and they were claiming to be Christians, and they were, but then we would go back in a few years later and we would gather their wives, and their wives would say, "Oh, yes, I'm a Christian." But when we would start asking them, they were a Christian because their husbands told them that they were now a Christian. Again, it's just the culture. It was nothing that they had never been able to understand what the difference was. Okay, so Hudson was born 1999, early 2000, before 9/11, there was a big conference in Arizona. And it was mainly among missionary wives, short-term missionaries like we were, among the Muslim countries. And they were finding the same thing, that there was just this roadblock with women. Men were easy to get to, the women were not. So what the women that at least were living in country were finding is that it was taking years and years and years and years to get to a position to be able, with a woman, to even be able to share their faith with them. So at that conference, they began praying, we need a tool to reach Muslim women. We need something that will take that barrier away, that we'll be able to at least get the gospel to them, because we couldn't even do that at this point. Okay, so put that all in the back of your mind, because that's an important piece of this puzzle. So, like I said, Hudson was born, 1999, 9/11 happened. We were scheduled to go back into Bangladesh the day after 9/11. So that got pushed, obviously, about 6 weeks, and we had to make some adjustments. 6 weeks after 9/11 happened, we didn't know yet what the world was going to look like. So Leah and I actually split the team and the husbands and wives. So he took half the team one way around the world and went to Bangladesh, and I took the other half the other way, and we met up. But in Bangladesh, that was the trip that I would say was the most immediate fruit. I always hesitate to say it was the best trip or the highest numbers or anything like that, because we really won't know, until we get to heaven what the best trip was. But that was the one where there was a lot of questions of why are you here? There were parades going through town against, or through all the major cities against America, but at the same time, because a lot of the Taliban by this time from Afghanistan had come over into Bangladesh. But it was all in all, it was a great trip, but people really had an issue, especially with me, leaving Hudson, who was 18 months old at the time. And they kept saying, you don't know what the world is going to be like over there, and you're leaving your 18-month-old. Now, of course, my in-laws were like, go. But they didn't care. All right, so that's another little piece. You got to remember that part. All right, July 14th, 2003. Like Paul said, Grace was 9 months, Hudson was 3, and we got the call that my biopsies had come back malignant. No family history whatsoever. There's nothing on any side. They've done multiple genetics tests. Every time a new genetics test comes out, MD Anderson calls me and says, hey, let's do another one. So they do. Nothing has ever been found of the question of, why? They have never been able to figure it out. But so the news immediately went from malignant to worse and worse and worse and worse. And they did not, like Paul said, they did not give much hope at all. All the research showed that if I even responded to the chemo that was available, there wasn't a chemo that was specific for my type of cancer. They said, even if you respond to chemo, at best, 5 years, at best. So, Paul especially, there were people that just immediately began praying, and Paul gave me a prayer pager that would drive my doctors crazy, because I would be in seeing one of my doctors, and they would just buzz and buzz and buzz. My doctor's like, what is that? But there truly were people everywhere around the world praying, and I do definitely, I think, no other reason besides the faithful prayers of people for me and for God's will, honestly. One of the earliest, one of the earliest things I think that God directed us and showed us was probably the first or second night after I'd been diagnosed. I was folding clothes, because that was still a requirement at our house. Things still had to get done. And I was folding clothes, and the TV was on. And they were documenting the death. It was like a 2020 or something like that. They were following this young girl's death. And she kept saying, Dad, where am I going? When I say young girl, she was college. Where am I going when I die? And he kept saying, I don't know, but you need to go and come back and tell us. And I just remember when that was said was, I now have the marching orders, not by my choice, but to walk into a cancer hospital that 10,000 people a day walk through those doors. And they may not know where they're going, but I know where I'm going, and I can tell them how to get to where I'm going. So in my simple little mind, I said, okay, great, I have my marching orders. This is why I have cancer. So it's not going to be that bad. So the next day we go to the hospital, and that's when they began saying, it's advanced, we don't know that we can treat it, we'll do the best we can. And the news just continued to get worse and worse and worse. So even back in 2003, it wasn't as much as it is now, but we're a very instant gratification society now. It was that way in 2003, nothing like it is now, but I'm also a planner. So here the doctors were saying, well, we're going to try this for 6 months. And I'm like, no. It's Tuesday. I need to know, am I going to be here at Christmas? I have to plan these things. And no, that was one of the hardest things for me, was not that question of, every morning you wake up and you say, okay, is this my last Monday? Is this my last year? Am I going to see the kids grow up to be 4, 5, 6 years old? That was the hardest thing for me. Now at 50, I kind of go, why was I wasting my time? But back then at 34, it was a huge concern to me of I needed to know what was coming next. How do I prepare my kids? Christmas was hard. I remember putting all the Christmas decorations away, and I labeled everything so that Lee would know how to get them out the next year if I wasn't there, where the wreath went, and what, he didn't know. So I was labeling everything, these were going to go to the kids, 20 years from now when the kids are grown, make sure these go to the kids. And that was why I did that, I don't know. Looking back, I shouldn't have put myself through that. But those were the things that were the hardest, was what does the future hold? We went to surgery in January 22nd of 2004, and the doctor said, what we find in surgery, what's left from the chemo, will help us determine your length of life. So I went to surgery. A week later, went back and met with my doctors. And I was blessed, honestly, to have and I don't say this lightly, but Dr. Singletary was known as the best doctor in the world for breast cancer. And she walked in, and she has this entourage of medical students behind her. So she walks in, and she said, I don't know how this happened. And she said, I went back to make sure we had actually removed part of the tumor when you first came to MD Anderson. But she said, when I went in to do your surgery, there was nothing there. There should have been, I had 3 tumors. The largest one was 6 millimeters. So really large tumors. And she said there should have been cell necrosis where the chemo had eaten the tumor. And she said there was nothing. And she said, if I didn't know that we had taken part of that tumor when you had first come here, I would have wondered if I had the right patient on the table. So all of it, she's crying, all the medical students are crying, and Leah and I are like, yeah, well, it wasn't really that big of a surprise, because that's the God we serve. That answer doesn't always come out that way, and I'm not saying that God would be any better or any worse if the answer was different, but that was just the plan that he had for me at that time. A little side note, Dr. Singletary, I had 3 doctors that were my main doctors. And, just to show you how God uses people, Dr. Singletary, I stayed in touch with her. She was my main surgeon. And like I said, she was the best in the world. About 5 years ago, she committed suicide. And I just kind of stood there when one of my nurses called to tell me, and I just went, are you kidding? The lives she changed, and yet there was no value? It just blew my mind. Anyway, that's a little side note. Okay, so those months, Lee and I both really felt like that God had given us a different mission field while we couldn't travel overseas while I was sick. And it sometimes became a game. We would go and we would sit in a waiting room, and we would wait to see who God was going to bring. Sometimes it was people that just needed someone to pray with. Sometimes it was people that just needed to know. Sometimes I think it was people that needed to know someone was worse off than they were, and so they'd come sit next to the young one in the waiting room because they would feel better about themselves. One time we were in the lab waiting room. I was waiting to have blood drawn. And there were probably 50 people crammed in there. And I was in one of those moods that I didn't really care what mission God had given me. I was just kind of in a mood that day. So I was flipping through the magazine thinking, I hate being here, I hate where I am. And they called me back. And there was a young couple that was sitting next to us. And the story goes, obviously I wasn't there, but unknown to us, my in-law's pastor was in the room. And so we didn't even know this was a repeatable story until the next Sunday, and my mother-in-law heard the story. So the man leaned over. He was also a young couple. She had ovarian cancer. She was 28. And he leans over to Lee. And just at that moment, 50 people just happened to all stop talking. And he leans over to Lee and he said, "How do we do this?" And the story goes that Lee didn't even miss a beat. And he said, the only thing I know is that I have to breathe in and breathe out God every second because I don't know how to do this either. So we walked alongside that sweet couple. We still are in touch with them every couple years. They live out in Port Arthur. Like I said, she had ovarian cancer. Hers was like a stage 2, I think. And she survived, obviously. But they had never set foot in a church. And they are so plugged into their church and involved now because they were able to find where that foundation needed to be when they walked through that really hard time. There were other times, I would go to the mall and the security guard at the mall was following me. So a side note, I never wore wigs for a couple reasons. My kids were young, and I was always worried that it might kind of concern them of, wait, mom has hair, mom doesn't have hair, mom has hair, mom doesn't have. So I never wore wigs. I just wore, like scarves and hats and things like that. So it was kind of obvious, that I was going through chemo. But a security guard was following me through the mall one day. And I'm trying to figure out, did I take something out of Target? Why is he following me? But, when he finally got up the nerve to talk to me, he was telling me that he had just started chemo. And he said, I don't know how to do this every day. How do you keep going to work? How do you keep moving forward? And, all I could tell him is when you're sick, and you bounce back as quick as you can. But I would routinely go to the mall and pray with him. And it was just really, it's people like that you saw a greater purpose in the suffering. But on the flip side of that, I got to see a part of God that I don't know that I would have seen any other way or in any other depth. So a long time ago, someone had described to me that God is like an iceberg. And I grew up in Alaska, so this makes sense to me. At the top, above the water surface, you see the iceberg, but underneath, it's huge. And so the part that we normally get to see is the top, the iceberg that you see above the water. But the depth of who God is all underneath. And in our lifetime, we're only going to catch a glimpse of the magnitude of who God is. But the God I got to meet during those times was a God that showed early on that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And that did not mean that I was going to be rewarded with healing. I didn't know that. I didn't know it until the test results came back, and I didn't know it till 2 or 3, and still, at 10 years, they were like, oh, it may come back. Even now, I'll go in next month, and they'll say, oh, it may come back. They're very cautious. But, the scripture says he's going to reward those who earnestly seek him. And it's not a reward of what I want, because he's not my genie, but he's not a genie in the bottle, but it's with who he is. And who he proved himself to be was faithful. There were many, many times where God would take his scripture that I knew from a little girl, and suddenly it would become new and amazing. So one of those times was, and I think it's in Mark that it talks about when you leave father, brother, mother, sister, you will be rewarded 100-fold in the life to come. Well, when you cross-reference it, our pastor spoke one day on when you cross-reference it in Luke, it actually says, or in Mark, whichever way you cross-reference it, it actually says in this life and the life to come. So when I heard that, I went, oh, okay, so I'm going to believe it because it's God's word. But it not only says you'll be rewarded in this life and the life to come, but it's rewarded 100-fold. Okay, 100-fold is a lot. And I kept thinking, okay, so back right after 9/11, I went to Bangladesh, and there was a lot of risk. Some people would say there was a lot of risk there. So how am I going to be rewarded 100-fold for that? So I said, okay, God, your word says it, so sure, I believe it. All right, and I moved on down the road because I thought, I'm never going to understand that. So in the midst of being sick, we have a national evangelist in Bangladesh. His name is Shahada. And when he found out that I had been diagnosed and that the news had gotten so bad, he sent an email and he said, hey, Leah, Friday is their Sabbath day in most Muslim countries. The Christian church there adopts that. He said, on Friday, I've sent word out to all of our churches, and on Friday at 12 o'clock, I'll have 100,000 former Muslims praying for you. And that's the 100-fold promise, because never in a million years, now I think 100,000 was an exaggeration by Shahada, but even so, never in a million years could I have imagined, a magnitude of that amount of people coming together to pray for me. And I do think that it's prayers like those that I did get many, many, many more years with Hudson, and then later with Grace when she was born. So, Pakistan. So after I got my test results back, they put me on an experimental chemo more just to be preventative. Well, it wasn't one that made me sick, so I was like, great, I can go back around the world again. So I was still on chemo, went to Bangladesh, which probably was not the wisest thing I'd ever done, but I went to Bangladesh, and it had never crossed my mind to talk about me being sick in Bangladesh or really anywhere else. And I'll tell you why, because I didn't want people that might be sick in those countries to think he was a magic genie, that, hey, become a Christian and you too can be healed. Because we all know healing is not always his answer. So it never crossed my mind. However, we were in a village, and suddenly my translator turns to me and he says, Leah, why don't you tell everyone about, the last 2 years of your life? So I started talking, and what immediately happened was the men left, and I was left with all the village women. And so, I kind of told the highlights of the story, and then all of a sudden, they're asking questions. I mean, these women are saying, were you ever afraid to die? Were you afraid to leave your children? How did you know? Because, I would answer the question, and they would say, are you afraid to die? I'm like, well, I was afraid of the painful part of it, but I wasn't afraid of where I was going, because I know, because that's secure. That place is, I have chosen, and that place is there. So suddenly what we found out was we now had a way to get the men away and to speak to the heart of Muslim women. So that night when we went back to the city, one of the missionaries there came through town, and I told him what happened, and he said, well, let's try it again. Let's see if it works again. So the next day, went out to another village, kind of waited till everyone was around and started telling the story again, and lo and behold, the same thing happened. The men left, and we were left with the women. So we then changed the purpose of the trip really quickly, and we brought in some women that, I told you about the pastors' wives. These women had since become Christians and were kind of ministering themselves. So we trained them very quickly in my story, how to tie it to certain Bible stories, and said, go out and see what happens. So now we were sending national women out. They would go out, they'd tell the story, they would talk about key Bible stories, and they were seeing the same results. The men would leave, and they could finally have a way to get to women one-on-one. So we decided to push the envelope a little bit more, and we said, okay, let's go into a little bit more of a traditional Muslim country like a Pakistan. I wanted Saudi Arabia, but couldn't even get visas into Saudi Arabia back then. So we tried to start getting into Pakistan. First trip I was going to take in, the visa got canceled from our side. So as Paul said, through kind of a long string of events, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan invited me to come in and talk at the universities. And it truly was, I kept telling them, I can't come if I can't tell the story. I'm not going to go in and build up your breast cancer campaign because I really don't care about breast cancer. I mean, I do, but I don't. I'm not going to come in and be your breast cancer spokesperson. What I want to do is tell the story, and I can't do that unless I explain that I was healed through the blood of Christ. So, like Paul said, they emailed back, and he was like, sure. I can't support it or deny it because I'm a government official, but come on. So the first university I went into was the University of Lahore, and so I shared, and afterwards, one of the deans of the college that I was sharing in came up to my government representative, and he's all excited. So I have a translator here beside me, and she's translating so I can hear what's going on. And the man is saying, how is she saying these things? And I'm taking a step back going, I'm going to jail. And I'm thinking, where's the door? And so he's, yabbering about it. And he said, my government representative says, well, what do you mean? And he says, do you know how many times she said the word breast? Okay, did you miss the blood of Christ? Did you miss the whole cross, he's the only way? Didn't even, I truly think sometimes people like that God just put his hands over their ears so that it just went right over his head. A couple days later, I was speaking at another university, and this time our U.S. officials were there, and then they also, for some reason, I don't know why, but they brought in TV cameras. So, I tell the story, and we had a question and answer time, and I had people write the questions down, mainly because it was a mix of men and women, and the Muslim women in that situation would not raise their hands. So the question came, were you afraid to die? And I, again, like I said before I answered the question, my place in heaven is secure because, I accept that Jesus, the true Son of God, he's the only the way, truth, and life. Okay, TV camera's right here. And I'm thinking, I really am going to prison now because now we have it recorded and it's being broadcast. Our missionaries that were 400 or 500 miles away in Karachi, which is way south in Pakistan, they called that night and they said it was all over the news. And it was they used that one snippet of, I had no fear of death because my place in heaven is secure, because Jesus, the true Son of God, which is blasphemy in an Islamic country, died on the cross for me. So those are just little snippets that we were able to see that we could reach Muslim women. So we quickly wrote, we put together a program that was in 3 pieces, sent it out by email to the missionary wives, women, multiple missionary organizations, and said, my name was nowhere on it, just the story, because it's not about me. So we sent it out, and it has been translated, who knows how many times now, but it's been translated in something like 14 different languages, and it's been modified to not only reach Muslims, but to also reach Hindus. And I'll occasionally get reports of friends of mine that know the story that will go into Nepal, or the most recent one was Nepal. And he came out of Nepal, and he sent me a text once he got back to, where he could. And he said, so we were walking along this hill somewhere, we're in some village, and I meet this man, and I'm telling him I'm from America, and he said, oh, you know what, my wife knows a story about a woman in America, and she starts telling my friend Jerry the story about this woman in America, and Jerry's like, wait a minute, I know this person, because it was I don't want to say my story, but it was the story that was in the program to where people can make that heart connection with Muslim women. So who knows where it's been. Again, my name's never been tagged with it, so it's just out there, and God can do whatever he wants to do with it. So it's getting late. Let me close with this. My whole story is not about anything I did. It truly is about the power of prayer. Because when I stand back and I look, I was a basket case through all that. And I stand back and I look at the people that consistently prayed for me, And I really think God honors the heart of a faithful prayer. And I again, whether I was going to live or die, God was going to be faithful to me. If you ever go to Springfield, Illinois, there's this awesome National Historic Center where they took Abraham Lincoln's neighborhood and they like froze it in time. It's the coolest thing ever. And next door to Abraham Lincoln's house is, I think it's called the Ashby House. And a pastor's prayer book is in there. And if you read the prayer book, it says that every day he walked past Abraham Lincoln's house and he would stop and pray that God would use Abraham Lincoln to change the course of the nation. And I remember thinking, my kids were young when we were there, but I remember pulling them both over to me and I'm like, you know what? Abraham Lincoln did great things, but he was the tool. And this is the man that prayed for him every day. He's the man that changed the course of this nation. So, that's my story. I was the tool. I'm the tool that gets to have fun and run all over the world. But I wasn't the one that changed the course of all those nations and all those Muslim women. It's all those people that prayed for me through those years that I think I'm going to get to heaven, and God's going to go, hey, move over. It's these long line of people that prayed for you that are the true heroes of the story. So people like Paul, I appreciate your prayers because you really led that. But I know many of you prayed for me through those years, and you are truly the reason I'm here. All right, we have question and answer. I know it's really late. Sorry.
You're fine.
Okay. I was telling Paul I did for work this morning, I did a seminar, and they, like at the end, pulled out this Jeopardy board and said, okay, y'all pick a question and ask Leah a question. No. But y'all can ask me. I'll try to answer your questions. It'll be easier than work. Yep. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. Yes, it was because I was talking about my breast. Yep. No. Mm-mm. So it's very taboo. That's a bad word. I shouldn't say taboo. It's very shameful to have breast cancer. If I were Muslim, and of course with my daughter Grace, she would not be marriable because I had breast cancer. And it's not a genetics thing, it's a shame thing. They attach diseases like that to sin. And so, yes, and it's also a modesty thing, but no, you start talking about. So, funny side note, when you do start talking to Muslim women, you've seen the pictures where they're in their full burqas and things like that. And they are, around men, very, very modest people. But when you get them with just women and we start talking about breast cancer, suddenly they're ripping their shirts off. Can you look at this? And I'm like, please. So you get them in private and the modesty goes out the window. Maybe it's just that heart connection. I don't know. But yes, it's because breast. Yeah.
Yeah, Leah, we have, I'm from Wynwood Presbyterian Church, and we have a couple that's in Bangladesh right now.
Oh, neat.
And he feels very, very threatened. Mm-hmm. Has the environment changed significantly when you were last over there?
So Bangladesh, honestly, there were a couple times where, there were mobs, and like one time I had to hide under the seat in the van so they wouldn't know I was an American, things like that. I've been more uneasy in Pakistan where, 2 blocks away a bomb went off and, things like that. But yeah, it's Bangladesh is still pretty uneasy. Not quite like Pakistan, obviously not like Afghanistan or Saudi, but yeah. You have a question, Paul?
So, Leah, sometimes you mentioned maybe when you're talking over the universities and hospitals that women actually ask for a Bible.
Oh, yeah.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah. So they did, especially one of my favorite things to do, and I still do this when I go into Karachi, is I love to go through their cancer hospitals and pray. Now, their cancer hospitals, I use that very, very loosely. It's, I think the hospital that I take the dog to is, at least the village hospitals are not truly hospitals. They're more like gathering areas. But they will ask for Bibles, and that's really a key. I would much rather get a Bible in the hand of a Muslim woman than me have 10 minutes with her, because God is faithful to his word, and you open his word up and he can convict anybody, that reads his word. So they will ask for Bibles. There have been many times, one time in particular, I was working my way through the beds in the hospital, and they're just, huge rooms of beds. And I accidentally skipped a bed. And so I get to the end of the row, and no, I didn't even have a translator with me, so they don't even know when I'm praying, right? Now, I knew enough of, like Isa'i is Jesus, so I knew enough where they knew I was praying in the name of Jesus. But this woman over here is hollering and yelling and screaming, and so finally one of the nurses came and got me and dragged me back over there, and I realized I had skipped her, and she wanted me to pray over her. So once you start in the hospitals like that, and once you would start passing out a Bible, they all wanted one. We would also give them, we would sometimes go in and show the Jesus film, and they loved the Jesus film. So yeah, they hungry for the truth.
Yeah. I have a question. You mentioned that when you were 34, going through that very hard situation with the diagnosis, that you're a basket case and you were, very hard to deal with being a planner. And now at 50, you just wish you hadn't given yourself that double stress, I guess. What did you do to combat that over the years? Practical application.
Over the years. Let's see. Well, perspective has changed a little bit. I think not only from getting older, but I think just from realizing what's important and what's not important. Also, I got tired. I have teenagers, and so planning kind of goes out the window with teenagers, and I finally went, hey, look, I don't have to plan everything. And I think, but honestly, I would say I have more trust in that I don't have to have everything planned out, because God is already there ahead of me. And I think really it's just growing in my faith that I can trust God, that I don't have to plan everything, because it's kind of stressful planning everything. But yeah, I would. And also, when I was sick, I immediately, probably within the first 2 or 3 days, I had a counselor that I went to, because I had to figure out how do I don't want to say teach Lee, because that's not what I mean, but how do I leave my kids? How do I prepare Lee and the kids if I were to die? So I really had a sounding board, because that's not something I could dump on him, because he was dealing with. I truly believe caretakers have it a whole lot harder than the person going through the disease. So I couldn't dump all that on him. So I had a counselor all those years, even years after, because you're still dealing with, what you went through those years. So I think that probably helped too. She probably told me a number of times, quit stressing.
Thank you, Leah.
Sure.